Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Greenberg. I'm the CEO of iUNU. It's a computer vision and AI technology company for farming. We have partners both outdoors and indoors, but we're hyper-focused on greenhouse farming, and we're talking a little bit today around how technology, especially, is driving the adoption of new tech, about how consumer demand is driving the adoption of technology, both indoors and outdoors. So when we dive into the patterns of society, we start to look at how we're going to map things over an X and Y axis. So when you look at production and you go back in the 1700s, 1600s, everything was largely decentralized. And that meant that the labor force, the majority of the human population, was in ag. And as people, we dealt with seasonality, and the goal was to maintain calorie sufficiency. Combine that with the fact that we then started to figure out how to travel. Humanity demanded that there was some way to deal with preservatives, and that's how we started to cross oceans and start crossing long journeys as people, and allowed us to explore new lands. And with those preservatives came the ability to have calorie abundance. And so as you start seeing World War I, World War II, the preservatives led to not only more calorie abundance, but also the ability to have improved preservation, where people were fascinated by the concept of having an abundance of fat and abundance of sugar. And there was no longer a starvation in the majority of population of trying to figure out how to survive. It became more of a taste around, oh, I have enough calories, so how do I get to decide what tastes good? As you start seeing that move along the decentralized to centralized axis, because of the calorie abundance, it made a lot more sense for us to have massive farms, right? The Industrial Revolution, everything led to the centralization of massive farm fields and wheat fields and corn fields. And that is where you go from the decentralized to centralized. And as you start getting more centralized with more preservatives, people started getting, and consumer demand really led to the demand-driven agriculture that we're moving to today, which allowed us to start moving back to distributed production. And the reason for that is that people no longer just wanted calorie sustenance, and because there's calorie abundance, now they wanted to have a decision over what they wanted to put inside their bodies. So as we start to see agricultural production over time, and we're talking about the adoption of technology, it's important to look at the broad patterns of humanity that have led us to this point. And so now with consumers and consumer demands changing, people demand more fruits, more vegetables, and they start demanding less preservatives, because no longer is it calorie sustenance, it now becomes a pickiness around what type of calories people put in their bodies. And so we started to see distributed production. Even though there's centralized ownership and people are flying around, people became health conscious, which then led to a demand for improved freshness, improved quality, improved taste. We believe now at the grocery store that we're entitled to berries every single day of the year in the grocery store. We believe now that we're entitled to avocados, right? That's something that even 20, 30 years ago on the East Coast wasn't prevalent. And so as we're looking at the pattern of society towards technology adoption, in order to be able to grow an abundance of all of the fresh fruits and vegetables, and in order to meet that demand, it requires new types of technology and new types of supply chains. Which then leads us to the supply chain discussion. And following that same pattern, you can see that not only did stakeholders have a change over time, but we start with the old days, right? Going back to farming locally in our own family farm, there was no supply chain, if any. You took it to the town or you preserved it and off you went. And then as preservatives started getting more prevalent, then a supply chain started to exist in the Silk Road. And all of a sudden from there, you led to the idea of, well, now there's a trade, and then it touched many different hands. And when it comes to produce and it comes to our food, the supply chain became quite extended to the point where after World War I, World War II, we started to see quite a robust supply chain. Why? Because we already had those trade networks. We had lots of ports, we had preservatives, we had calorie abundance. And so now you could take a dried peach or a dried apple or a dried mango, and you could put it anywhere in the supply chain, or you could take the same thing with a Snickers candy bar, right? All of those could be transferred anywhere in the world based on a robust supply chain, and it would touch 3, 4, 5, 6 different hands before it ever hit a consumer. And then humanity came up with the concept of lean and Six Sigma within supply chains, and people started trying to increase the efficiency because it allowed them to get priced down. Why? Because consumers are always demanding not only fresh and not only good looking food, but they're also now demanding lower prices because they can get pickier. And that led to cutting out some of the middlemen. And as you see today, there's much more centralized, few distributors that do the majority of the distribution, with some last mile distribution. So the most hands it usually ever touches when it comes to our food is anywhere between 3 or 4. And as we're seeing time go on, you're starting to see more disintermediation of supply chain where it goes straight from vendors and producers directly to the consumer. And those like Crowd Cow and these CSA boxes, and when you order online, it's effectively removing the entire supply chain and going directly from farm to the consumer. And we're seeing more and more of that. So when you start looking at technology and how that fits within that pattern, you start to see the left-hand side here, the y-axis, hardware versus software. And then on the normal x-axis here, time, the phone lines were sort of the beginning of the hardware of technology when it comes to what we call technology today. And the phone lines were that core platform infrastructure where we built things like Netscape and AOL on these phone lines. We all remember those dial tones. At least if you're above the age of 30, we all remember those dial tones. And so as we start to see that infrastructure was laid on phone lines, then all of a sudden you built the internet on top of it. People started to build software on top of those phone lines, and it was very lightweight, but it was enough that you could deliver an interesting experience with ones and zeros on top of the phone lines and core infrastructure of the internet. And you can see that sort of peaked in the 2000s, and especially the early 2000s, because it started to become very clear that everything that you can do with just a basic phone line infrastructure has been pretty much maximized. And then the next version of technology had to come from new last mile platforms of connectivity. So now instead of just having a phone line connected to the internet, can I have my farm or my tractor or my greenhouse connected to the internet? And that's where you start talking about last mile platforms. And once you have your phone and your tractor connected to the internet, as opposed to just the farmhouse phone itself, then all of a sudden you start getting new types of data, which new types of actions, which gives you new types of efficiency. And so this is how we look at the pattern of technology adoption inside of farms today, because you start seeing that pattern of up and down, and that gives you where we are in the fact that you're seeing a lot of connected tractors, a lot of connected irrigation, a lot of weather prediction, and a lot of connected farms in general, both in greenhouses and outdoors. That's where you see we're basically at that apex today. And pretty soon we're going to start to see new things built on top of it tomorrow and back to that same pattern. So when you put them together, it's fascinating because you start to see the overlay that is, well, we started with survival, we had preservatives, we got preferences because of calorie abundance, and you overlay the hardware software patterns, you start to see that the consumer demands have led to, and the health consciousness have led to things like the local movement, or fruits and vegetables becoming more prevalent, CSA boxes from outdoors, and a lot of the health conscious, whether it's almonds, whether it's higher protein soy coming from some of the larger farms. Technology adoption and technology is really being driven by consumer demand. So here's this long tail consumer demand pattern overlaid with the adoption of technology. And then you'll notice tomorrow, we're going to start to see as the local movement and as more of the health conscious and the calorie specific and the calorie preference, consumers are demanding better, fresher, and more transparent food. the technology to be able to do that at low cost has to be developed and iterated on. So this is how we see the pattern of tomorrow unfolding. Is it's no longer going to be the tractors connected to be able to give people that transparency. But when you say your produce is organic, or your produce is local, or your produce is some sort of new label, whatever that is, there are going to be very simple plant provenance and food safety transparency ideals that come behind it, and the technology to prove it, right? That idea that you can track something down to the specific fruit level is not far away, due to the fact that we're seeing the apex of consumer demand and technology come together. So how does this all work, and what's really driving this? The concept around computing cost and labor cost is an important one to unpack. The labor costs are rising dramatically. We all hear about the labor shortage, but the labor shortage is really driven by not just the labor itself, but it's also the types of jobs, right? So when you're dealing with the types of jobs, the industry, the farming industry today has thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands, if not millions of jobs open. But the people who want to do those jobs, because it's backbreaking work, aren't necessarily sitting in the US today. And that's why we have the H-2A program. And the H-2A program fills some of that void, which means some other people come from outside of the US and they do seasonal work and then go home. But even the H-2A program is getting quite expensive, to the point where we see people paying $15, $20, $22 an hour for backbreaking work, because no one in the US and no one who's a citizen wants to do that job today. So with this labor cost skyrocketing and compute costs falling, it becomes a trend that is very clearly figuring itself out. Now, when you start looking at computing power and computing cost, you start to see that the power is going up, and the fact that they can do more thinking and more iterations on the edge. You can see the computing cost coming way down. So when people are starting to run analysis, we can either send someone to go do the inventory tracking, or send someone to go measure the health of a plant, or measure the height of a plant, or you can send technology to do that. The acceleration of this adoption, now that we understand the pattern of how hardware and software, as well as the fact that consumers are really pushing the acceleration of this adoption, combined with the fact that computers are getting cheaper, chips are getting cheaper, and yes, there's a supply chain shortage, but they're still relatively low cost compared to a $25 an hour person who's going to do something that a computer can do. And then people start talking about things like LEDs, and LEDs are used in lights for tractors. They're used in farming, they're used in indoor farming, they're used in all types of aspects of a packing house, and LED efficiency has led to also lower costs. And so again, we're seeing more efficiency, more lumens per watt, and that's again another tailwind that's accelerating the adoption of technology in farming. Here's that trend again of the hourly wage, and you can see that it's happening pretty quickly. When you look in 1990, just 30 years ago, people on average were making even less than what you see on this chart today. We remember people making $5, $6 an hour. And then you start to see storage, and storage is important because the way computers remember what things were and happened before and after, and identify patterns, requires an ability to remember. And so storage, now that's getting cheaper, right? So it's accelerating this concept that technology is being accelerated by consumer demand, because people want a very specific answer. It's a fresh, it's a good looking, it's a delicious piece of food that isn't going to make them feel bad after they eat it. That type of demand is such a driver that now we're having to use, again, more technology, more analysis to be able to drive higher quality produce, because people pay top dollar for it. And then in order to do that, you have to remember how you grew things before and how you grew things in past seasons to bring it to bear today. And that's what having lower cost of storage allows you to then go back and remember and find those patterns and improve for next year. Semiconductors, all of our phones, all of our cars, all of our tractors, all of our packing houses all have semiconductors in it. Those are getting cheaper, right? So we're seeing hardware get a lot cheaper, and we're seeing labor get a lot more expensive. And together, that again is driving a lot of that acceleration. And then finally, a very important part of this is just the concept of organic, and whether or not you believe in what the label is there to exist to do, the concept that people are demanding a certain type of quality in their mind, demanding a certain type of fresh and good looking, that's what they care about. Whether or not it has the organic label is not the point. The point of the slide is that people are demanding it, and it's very clear because you're seeing double-digit growth every single year as the population is willing to pay more and more for blueberries. Like blueberries, or even you look at the idea of organic cereal, people are paying top dollar for that like never before, and they're willing to do it all year round. And then is the last point I wanted to make, that sort of driving the technology concept and driving not just the adoption of technology, but also in the way that we're implementing it, is we're running out of people who grow up. Kids no longer want to grow up and become farmers. That's not something they want to do. And just 150 years ago, everybody was okay being a farmer, right? That was more than 30% of our population. But today, if you tell a kid they have to work 6-7 days a week farming, hard work, thinking through it, long days, working with the fields, working inside of a greenhouse, there aren't many people who actually want to do that, and that's not enticing enough. And so when you look at the age of growers here, you see that we're seeing acceleration towards the older generations, and the replenishment of them is not sustainable, and it's not even going to work. So something has to give. And so what we're seeing here is we're not only having to use technology to fill a void in cost, but pretty soon we're going to have to use technology to fill a void in tribal knowledge. And so consumers are driving that change in the landscape, but with that landscape is going to have to be able to remember and learn from a lot of the people who are then retiring. And so with the age of the growers going up to the point where we only have about 10 or 20 years left of the majority of the people who know how to farm effectively, combined with that lower cost of bringing technology to bear, this is where we think something has to give in a big way. And so this is why we like to talk about how farming is being changed and technology is being a large part of the answer, but it's not all of the answer, and it's not being driven by the fact that technology is trying to go into something. It's more being pulled by the market because of the filling of the void that exists between both the skilled labor and growers, and also the unskilled void of people who aren't there, not enough people to fill those jobs. So appreciate you taking the time today and thinking through all this with me, and open to any questions.
Okay. I don't have any questions right now from anyone, but so if you'd like to post any questions for Adam, that would be great. Adam, when someone comes to you, this is for my own knowledge, when someone comes to you saying, hey, I'm 60, 70 years old and they don't have anyone to leave their farms to, with the autonomy and all of that kind of stuff, how expensive it is expensive, but how will that help that grower or that farmer be able to continue farming maybe for the last 10 years of their lives in order to be able to, send it or, be able to sell it with everything that comes with it so that it can move forward and give people who are younger that may not know what farming is all about. But when you take out that labor, that seems to be what a lot of people don't want to have, and then have them take over as farmers where the equipment is easily running on its own and farming becomes a little bit less laborious.
It's a good question. We're seeing customers go two different ways. One, a lot of farmers are saying, I don't want to invest in this future. It's not for me. And they're selling to a larger farm to consolidate, selling to their friends. And we're seeing a consolidation from a farming perspective. And the second way we see it going is a lot of people are investing in that automation for a longer term horizon, where I don't want my kids to have to work 7 days a week. I want them to be able to work 4 or 5, and this automation will help them do that. And so it's sort of more of an aggressive mindset, or this isn't for me. It's past what I want to do. And they're two very different ways of handling the same situation. But investing that automation has a lot of cost to it, and it has an ROI that are in some cases, 3 years. And some people are willing to invest in that. And in farming, depending on the year, the margins can be slim. And so if they have the propensity to invest in it, sometimes they will, and other times they find it easier to say, look, I'm once I retire, then I'm done with the business, and other people want to keep it in the family.
That's interesting. You mentioned, you and I chatted a little bit before, the cost of bringing a regular farm, maybe, 1,000 acres, to an autonomous type of operation. Which equipment would you start with first?
Yeah, so for the largest costs in a farm, they're usually labor, and if it's something like a greenhouse, it includes a lot of electricity. Otherwise, if it's outdoors, oftentimes there's some other costs around it, right? Inputs like fertilizer or pest and pathogen mitigation. And what we usually look at is what type of automation is the easiest that has the most amount of ROI. And so you have to run a different, some farms have huge pest and pathogen issues, and dealing with the input costs is usually the primary driver for value. And they'll look for something that has early detection of issues. They'll be working with computer vision, or they'll be working with satellite data. That's one way. And other people just want straight the automation, right? And they'll be looking at automated combines and things like that, and automated packing houses for specialty crops, things like that. So when we see what you invest in is different than how much you invest, and we're seeing a lot of people right now put in anywhere between 7 and 10% of revenue into the different parts of automation and technology every year in terms of their budget. And some of that's CapEx, and some of it's OpEx. Or for example, there are a lot of ERP systems out there that charge about 5 to 7% of revenue, but they allow you to manage 10 to 20 different farms at once, and that's what they do.
And conversely, would someone be able to, like, I know there's a lot of big people with a lot of money buying up farms who, with that capital, could easily be able to buy this type of equipment and not be farmers. They could be people who have other companies or a subsidiary of a company, and they could be running farms with all autonomous equipment. Is that happening now? I know there's a lot of people, all up in arms about, big companies buying big farms so that they can, it's just a business that they know everybody needs. And if they have the money to buy that equipment, then the labor costs for them obviously is going to go down.
Yeah, we're seeing it sort of go two ways as well on that one, which is some people we're probably about 5 years away from basically a fully autonomous farming world, right? Where there's pretty close to that. It's accelerating quickly, a lot quicker than most people expected, but that requires a lot of CapEx. And so some investors are looking at this from an aggressive perspective, which is, hey, we want to invest in putting together a bunch of different farms and then investing in the technology or the automation to be able to roll it up in a way that is efficient. And other people, we're seeing a lot of other investors buy up farms and just buying them to hold them, and they won't invest at all in the technology and automation. And so it just depends on the style of investor, and if they're trying to squeeze every penny out of it, which a lot of them are, and other ones are trying to invest in how do we scale this up and get an arbitrage margin, where if we were a small farmer, we would be making 6% net profit. But if we put 10, 20 farms together, sort of like I'll think of it like a financial collective, you get sort of 10 to 12% gross profit, right? Just because you can get those economies of scale.
All right, I have a question here. How do you see the move towards larger and larger farms with fewer farmers being able to adapt to more specific wants from consumers?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The level of automation is hitting an apex that right now consumer demand is driving a lot of this adoption and driving the changes to a farmer. But once you have a high level of automation, the consumer demand actually changes the fact that with a lot of automation, you can create a far increase in diversity of plants. So right now we're seeing monocropping, and we're seeing how the roll-ups of farms together are actually hurting small farmers and hurting the gross profit of those small and medium farms, because the large farms are rolling up to be able to get the economies of scale. And there's a lot of consumer pressure to lower prices, right? So it's not like the prices to consumers, the prices are high, and to farmers, the prices are low sometimes. And the reason that delta is because the supply chain is getting more expensive. And that's why we're seeing those efficiencies there. And trucking is at an all-time high. Logistics are at an all-time high. Shipping is at an insane all-time high. I think we went from paying $5,000 to $6,000 per container on a container ship to paying $17,000 per container. And so we're seeing that the logistics lead to higher consumer prices, and consumers can keep trying to put prices down. And that's where you need those economies of scale to keep up. And then the other thing is, once you hit that pattern matching of the apex of automation, oftentimes you can start putting different and new crops through that automation that allow you to change with consumer demand, because now you have such an automated part of the system, you have such an automated farm, that now you get out of the monocropping and get into multi-cropping, because it is so autonomous. You can put any widget, if you will, through that manufacturing process.
All right. And we don't have any more questions, but we want to thank you, Adam, for taking the time with us. Like I said, he's over there in Holland right now doing some research, I'm sure. And we want to thank you for taking the time to give us this presentation. I will get Adam's email address, and I will post it on this presentation for you all. And if you have any questions, you can email Adam at any time. Right, Adam? We're okay with that?
Absolutely.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time, and everyone else, enjoy the rest of the presentations.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.